Welcome back, Star Wars fans, to another episode of Stories by Darksaber Light. I'm Jess.
And I'm Arica Jade.
And this is your podcast for everything related to Star Wars and storytelling. And we've got a lot to talk about tonight. We will be reacting to the most recent episode of the Book of Boba Fett, From the Desert Comes a Stranger. And wow, this was an episode that just I had no idea who was gonna turn up next. So you've probably already been seeing lots of reactions to this episode. We're hoping to give a bit of a different spin on that. We'll be reacting to the episode itself, but then the bulk of this episode is really going to be a very deep dive into a lot of the stuff that we got with the Jedi and the ideas of attachment and love and all of these things that were so prominent in this episode. So as such, this is going to be a great episode, helmed more by our lovely Arica Jade, who we've always had this great partnership of kind of love for Mandalorians and Jedi, and as such, one of us being more of a Mandalorian expert, one of us being more of a Jedi expert. So I am just super psyched to hear what she has to say and what she brings to all of us. So Arica, give me your thoughts on this episode.
This was a lot to take in. I think that everybody was expecting something big from this episode, but definitely not as much as we got. Especially considering I'm pretty sure half the episode was dedicated to Luke Skywalker. I don't think anybody saw that coming. I think that there were some people who would theorize, oh, we're going to see Luke. And I think those who would theorize that had figured, well, it's just going to be a cameo. But then we got something like 20 minutes of Luke Skywalker training Grogu with some incredible deep fake work. I cannot remember the name of the YouTuber that Lucasfilm hired.
Shamook, I believe.
Okay, yeah, but they did an incredible job with it. When they first showed his face, I was very shocked. It was like my brain couldn't really process what I was seeing. Because it's just this thing where it's like, yes, it looks like young Mark Hamill, but the intellectual side of my brain knows that Mark Hamill is not young anymore, and yet it looks like him. And it was just, I've been in this loop of like, how is this real for the past couple of days? So that was a lot to take in. I think part of me is still kind of in a bit of a state of shock over that. And then of course we had Ahsoka and Luke together, and we had Cobb Vanth and Cad Bane, and it was just a lot.
It was a lot, and I mean, I'm seeing so many people reacting to the fact that Tamara Morrison and Ming-Na Wen have had top billing for the last two episodes, so get those paychecks, but they've kind of been reduced to cameos, Boba Fett especially in his own show. I really I get that criticism, I really do. It's kind of thrown me for a loop too, especially since I was really just getting into Boba's story and really excited to see what they were going to do next. I guess for me, I'm just always kind of the person to say, well, let's see how it shapes up, how involved Boba is in the finale. I also think that this is all part of this greater big Mandoverse. I could easily see Mandalorian season 3 involving a couple episodes that are very Boba heavy, depending on where he ends this series. So I guess for me, I get people's complaints about that. But I also just kind of think that it could have been marketed a little bit more generally instead of calling it the Book of Boba Fett. But I still think that this has been a great show. I certainly have come to a much better appreciation for Boba. And I never thought I would say this, but I'm actually really excited to see if and how Boba will continue to be involved in this story.
Yeah, I have to agree with all of that. I definitely think that this show has made me warm to Boba in a way that I didn't think that I would. But I do understand the complaints about it seeming like the title is kind of a misnomer in the fact that it's like, well, Book of Boba Fett featuring some side chapters with our friends doing other things. And yeah, I saw somebody somewhere, and I'm sorry, I can't remember who said this because I kind of go through a lot of fan comments, and then um but I saw somebody, and I maybe it was like a couple of people saying that this is kind of one Star Wars maxi series where it's basically just Star Wars the series, like this is just Star Wars now, and they've broken it up into sub series, so it's less of this show is dedicated to this specific character and more of like this is just part of the bigger storyline, and that's kind of how they're putting it together. I do think that there is an issue with how they market it because of course people are going to get the wrong idea if you name something something and that's not all that it is. um Given this experience, I am fully prepared to go into the shows that are next on the lineup, which are all I think named after a specific character, expecting that those shows are not going to be all about those characters. Like that's just I'm going off of that assumption now, so I'm not going to get all worked up about like why are they spending every episode of this on Cassian Andor? I don't, like this. So
It is really funny that they are all marketed that way. Before this live action influx of content, it was the Clone Wars, Rebels, Resistance. And now it's the Mandalorian, the Book of Boba Fett, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Ahsoka, Andor, and the Bad Batch. All the way down the line. And I really, if this is the kind of storytelling that they're going to do, I really wish they would not market it that way. Because even with something like the Bad Batch, which was going to be, I always knew it was going to be pretty similar to the Clone Wars, which was itself an anthology. People were always complaining about, oh, it's just a cameo show. Oh, it's just them jumping from one planet to the next. They're not even involved in their own show. And I'm like, I get it. But at the same time, that was kind of the way it was billed. So I don't know. I wish that it's funny that we're watching a TV show called The Book of Boba Fett, and it just makes me think like, you know, we do judge books by their covers. I'm in publishing, and if your book doesn't have a good title, and if you don't accurately represent what the book is in the title and the cover, then that is going to affect who picks it up and what they think of the content inside. So I don't know. These are not the decisions that I would be making if I was the one naming these shows.
yeah, I don't know if it's like a Disney naming convention because they've had issues with naming stuff before, like how the Bear and the Bow got renamed Brave, and I really don't know where that came from. I think the previous title made way more sense with the plot of that movie, but somebody decided to change it. Yeah, so well, yeah, I don't know. I do agree. I think that they could do better with being more accurate to the naming convention.
Yeah.
But we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. They've clearly got a thing going on, so we'll just let them go with it. And like you said, I think that I will change my expectations of what I am going to expect to see in these shows. I will be very upset if Obi-Wan Kenobi is like 6 episodes long and 2 of them reduce him to a cameo. I'm just gonna say that. But I think that there's so much else to say about this episode. As you mentioned, we got a lot of cameos. it's pretty on par. I think we were all expecting that for a Filoni episode. Um, Definitely got Ahsoka, got his girl in there. Um, and we also got the return of Luke Skywalker and the introduction of Cad Bane, both of these characters who relied heavily on technology to bring them to the screen. Um, I'm seeing lots of reactions to Luke, generally, like you said, much more positive in relation to the finale of The Mandalorian season 2. And I think that in the immediate aftermath of the episode, there was a lot of just general excitement at the fact that I mean, I did think it's incredible that we did just watch an episode of new Star Wars content with young Luke Skywalker interacting with Ahsoka and all of these other characters. And I just think like that is amazing and that is terrifying at the same time. Um, as the week goes on, I'm seeing a lot more people kind of like, it was nice to see, but this is something that I just don't feel very comfortable with. We've already recast Han and Lando. Why aren't they recasting Luke and Leia as well? And honestly, I can't disagree with that. But do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I can see both sides of it. I mean, I kind of leaned towards them recasting, at least after Mandalorian season 2, because I just thought to myself, like, how long can they sustain doing that if they want this character to play more of a role in it than just a cameo? And I was kind of worried that, well, that's all we're going to see of Luke because of the technological element of it. Then again, this episode, they delivered half an episode with Luke Skywalker, and it was both exciting and kind of weird. I can understand why they're choosing to go that route because I guess they really want it to look like the original as much as possible. I guess so. I don't know, the audience doesn't have to suspend disbelief. I'm not really sure what it is. But at the same time, I saw an article about this and I forget where it was from, that was talking about going for the argument that if they want to continue using him long term, then it would make more sense to recast him because this is obviously, it's going to take a lot to keep doing this. And it, yeah, and they can't exactly match like the full humanity of a real actor having those facial expressions and the vocal inflections. And yeah, I mean, like, I get it. I get where it's coming from on both sides. I think that it would be very interesting to see, the next time that we see Luke, because I definitely think we are going to see him again, how the technology has improved from now to then, because it, it improved monumentally from just, a little over a year ago. Um so
Well,
to
they're not
see,
using the
yeah,
same technology though now.
yeah, so it'll be interesting to see like how even what they're using now might advance in that time period. But at the same time, it's also like, should you continue to do that at the expense of really having the full range of human emotion that you can get from an actor who
Yeah.
looks very much like Mark Hamill? And it's funny because I saw some things circulating around, very like in the aftermath of the episode, of like Sebastian Stan still being very open to actually doing this if they were to contact him. And it's just, I mean, like, he's always joked about this and is very um you know just I'm not sure what to say. Like, he's takes it very well, and he knows, like, a lot of fans have wanted to see that, and he's still joking about Mark Hamill being his dad and that kind of thing. So I don't know, like, I get why they want to go for that level of accuracy, but at the same time, it would be nice to see a little bit more of the nuance and expression on his face, in his voice, and the same thing for what other characters they decide to bring in, because I think that there's a very strong possibility now that they have this at their disposal. Okay, we can just, we can bring back Han, we can bring back Leia, we can bring back Lando, or even somebody like Wedge. And yeah, I guess we'll just see. I'm just kind of like sitting on it and just wanting to see, how do they go forward with it, and technologically how do they advance with it, and will there be a point when they decide, well, maybe we should actually recast, or have they gone past that point now, because everybody's kind of sort of getting used to the idea of like, oh, they're just going to keep deep faking it.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I think that the bigger thing is that they boxed themselves into a corner. They wanted to bring Mark Hamill back for the season finale of The Mandalorian. Mark had a great time doing that. I don't think that Mark was even involved in this one. And so the problem with seeing him again is that it would be really weird if he had been deep faked the last time and now he was just a totally different actor.
Mm-hmm.
When it's the same age, same basic context. So I understand why they went this route. I really hope it's done now. I don't expect to see him in the finale. I don't think that we will. But if we see him in the future, yeah, I think that recasting and just, we've had two different Hans, we've had two different Landos. It's fine. You get used to it. And I think that that's a better use of the characters. I think it's a better, more ethical use of actors. And I just really like, it's scary. Like, it is like, it's really cool. The future is here, but this really is one of those things where it's kind of like, we can do it, but should we?
Yeah.
So I think that I would prefer to see somebody else take over the role if we see him again in the future. And the other thing too is that, you're right. It's never going to be perfect. There always are still those little moments where you can just tell it's kind of got that uncanny valley factor. And even more so, the visual technology vastly improved when they hired Shamook, but they're still dealing with the fact that this only works because Luke is a fairly monotone character in this context, and they're playing that up because I think that it's the vocal technology that isn't up to speed. And so when they are trying to get the visuals and the vocals to match, it's okay with this character, but imagine if they tried to do it for somebody like Anakin in Kenobi, somebody who's far more wide ranging in his vocals. It's not going to work. And things will improve, but I think about that kind of stuff and I go, this is just not something that I want to be watching long term on my screens. We've had it a couple times. It's very interesting. Let's move away now.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, I'm not so bothered as much by the visual aspect of it. Like, I think that I could actually come around to watching visually more of deep fake whoever. It's the voice that really tripped me up, because it's just that they can't get the nuance in the vocal inflection exactly the way you would with a real person. And that was the thing that tripped me up, because I don't think that Luke was intentionally being portrayed as like an emotionless robot. I don't think that's what they're going for, but it's like when you have that voice that's coming out of a computer program, you're not going to be able to get the level of humanity, like I said, that you expect from an actual human voice. And so that might have thrown people off a bit. And it's not so much the portrayal of the character, it's just that the technology can't match what a real person can do.
Right. Right. Yeah. I'm It's interesting. I've been amused. Now I'd like to see the character picked up by somebody else if they're gonna continue to use him. So but we'll see what happens. Now it's also really interesting that we're getting these formerly only seen in animation characters like Cad Bane. We've seen we've seen Bo-Katan make the move from animation to live action as a human. Then we've got Ahsoka, who as a Togruta's kind of near human, and now we've got Cad Bane, who's just very not human, and very interesting to see how they kind of interpreted him a little bit differently. There were also some fans who um, tried to create an image of Cad Bane that was a little bit more in line with the Clone Wars, and there's nothing that happens in the fandom anymore that doesn't cause drama. I guess people, saying like, oh, don't fix what the we need to stop trying to fix these live action portrayals, and people saying, no, this isn't fixing anything. This is just a reimagining something that's a little bit closer to what we saw in the Clone Wars. Um, eh, I thought that his live action appearance works just fine. We knew exactly who he is. This is much later time period. In fact, I've complained before about how I wish that Bo and Ahsoka actually looked the ages that they're supposed to. So I'm not going to complain about Cad Bane actually looking a little bit older than he did.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was fine. And honestly, I do think that they're in a place where the effects and the technology that they're using are constantly evolving. And that's kind of how Star Wars has always operated, like pushing the boundaries in terms of what you can do with special effects, with practical effects, with digital effects. And they're just continuing that tradition. And so I don't think anything that we're seeing right now is going to remain static. They're going to keep working on it. They're going to keep looking at the feedback and figuring out, well, how can we fine tune this and do this better and make it look better. Because at least on Ahsoka, I thought she looked better in this than she did in Mando season 2. I don't know what, like, I couldn't pinpoint right now specifically what I thought looked better, but it was just like the general appearance just seemed to read better to me than her first appearance in Mandalorian. So I think that they are taking steps to just learn and grow from what they've done. And I'm of the opinion that we should just continue letting them do that. I mean, these are creative people in a creative space where that's how these kinds of people thrive. So they're going to keep learning, and they're going to keep developing those skills and coming up with new ways to do things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to get to the bulk of our episode, the real deep dives, but a couple other things that I also wanted to reflect on. Cobb Vanth is back. I love him, our corn cob man. I love that he's so assured of himself even when he doesn't have the armor anymore. I was also very anxious for him the entire time because of that. But I just really like that character. I like that he's just such a good guy who cares about his people, and I love the fact that as he's stopping the Pikes from bringing spice into the area, things like the fact that he tells them to dump the spice, and they say, this is worth more than your town. He says, maybe I'll retire, but he doesn't. He dumps that spice out. That's not he's not going to sell that to anybody. He's not getting rich off of that. He's not going to unload it on anybody else. And I just really like that character. I assume that he's okay. There were a couple characters that we were left with not knowing their fates in this episode. Cobb, Garza Whip, which I'm kind of like, I really hope that she's not gone. I just feel like that would be very egregious, and I really like that character. Um, and I know that everybody is very, very concerned about our little Max Rebo. So hopefully we find out what happened to him.
Yeah. I was really happy to see Cobb Vanth again. Just from the episode opening, I knew he was gonna show up. And but it was great. I think Timothy Oliphant, he's a wonderful actor and he has such great presence on screen playing this character. So it's just wonderful seeing him, and I'm glad that he's getting pulled into this storyline, considering that they were on Tatooine and they were bringing Din into the story, and I knew that he had a connection with Cobb Vanth. I was like, he's gonna go try to recruit him, and that's pretty much exactly what happened. Um, I think that standoff that he had with Cad Bane was really well executed. I thought it was very well directed and edited as well, like just the tension in that scene and how much it echoed what you would see in old westerns was really fantastic. um and just to point out like a little tiny detail, I know some people were freaking out because they thought that he might be dead. I don't think that he's dead. I think that Cad shot him the same way he shot Hunter in Bad Batch. It was that shoulder shot. um and I'm guessing it was probably done as a warning. Plus, we know that Boba has a Bacta tank and he no longer needs to use it. So there we go. As for Garsa, I do hope she's alive. That was it was a bit of a shock to see that blow up, but I hope there's some way that she made it out of that. Max, I don't know. From what I remember, he wasn't in there. So yeah, I was joking with some other people that he's apparently force sensitive, like he just senses when there's danger coming, and so he's decided I'm not going to work today. Something bad's gonna happen, and so he's not there. So I don't know, maybe Max should train to be a Jedi, who knows, but I hope we'll see him again too.
Hopefully the show just ends with, I don't know, I them somewhere. I guess probably not Garsa's place, but it'll the book of Boba Fett will just end with Max Rebo playing us out. So, um, yeah. Anything else? I really liked seeing Ahsoka with R2D2. I liked his little happy beeps as they were together because it was just so Clone Wars. And um yeah, I don't know. That was also something that I was really excited to see Ahsoka with Luke, because we don't really know if she's going to function as a master to his apprentice, but now we do have a direct line between Yoda, Dooku, Qui-Gon, Obi-Wan, Anakin, Ahsoka, Luke, Grogu. And so that lineage has grown even larger, um, since now we know that they are connected and at least having some kind of um, contact together. So I thought that was a lot of fun to see too.
Yeah, I think that was the thing that surprised me the most about this episode, is that they actually showed Luke and Ahsoka together, because I sort of assumed that they would save that for showing their actual first meeting. And I do have mixed feelings because I loved seeing them together in this. And it's one of those things that my brain still can't wrap, like, I can't wrap my mind around it still. I'm still in this state of shock where I'm like, did I just witness that? Like, was this real kind of thing? Um, but at the same time, I'm just like, oh man, I wish they had just saved it, for her show, when we got to see them interact for the very first time, and probably have that conversation of, I used to be your father's master, and I'm Anakin Skywalker's son, and like all of that. I think that the emotional gut punch would have hit harder had they kind of held off on showing that. I do understand why they did it here, but and I do expect that we're probably going to get some kind of flashback in Ahsoka's series to their actual first meeting, because that's a gap that's been left now by the timeline, and it needs to be filled, because I do think that she's definitely acting very different here than she did at the end of Mando season 2. Like, she just seems way more at ease, like almost more at peace than she was the last time we saw her. And I feel like, well, did that meeting happen in the interim somehow, and that's why her general demeanor has changed, and she seems to it just struck me as she seems to have gotten that closure for Anakin's story. Like, it seems like she's had that conversation with Luke already and potentially seen Force Ghost Anakin. So, but we haven't seen it. So, and I think that's like my one minor gripe is I know Star Wars is known for jumping around in the timeline. Like, it has never done anything in order, and they're still kind of doing that now. It is a little bit confusing because sometimes there are things that happen and I'm like, well, like, where in the timeline is this happening? Like, did this meeting or did this thing happen before this, or does it happen after this? And I don't doubt that they'll try to clarify it more, but it does get a little bit frustrating when they keep doing things like that. And I would hope that they try to edge away from it more, just so it's not as confusing for some people to follow. Because if they're going for this whole maxi series type vibe with all of this stuff, it's gonna be a lot for people to keep track of if they keep jumping around like that. But that's just my opinion on it.
Right. I don't disagree. I'm sure that we'll see more of it later. The one thing that I really hope is that at this point, Luke has probably told Ahsoka what happened to Obi-Wan, and that's something that she never knew. So that's something I hope that she's gotten closure on too, that all those years of wondering what happened to him. Because in the Ahsoka book, she can't feel either Obi-Wan or Anakin, and it's a real source of distress for her. So like you said, she does seem more at peace in this one, and I assume that she's received a lot of clarity as Luke has from talking to her as well. So I'd love to know more about that. But I guess that's a good segue into talking more about the Jedi and everything that we got in this ep from Luke and from Ahsoka and from little Grogu, who we finally saw again. If you're watching on the YouTube version, we've got little Grogu here. He's saying hi. It's very nice to see him again. So, but yeah, it was I didn't expect so much of this episode to be taken up with a lot of talk about Jedi philosophy. And we've got a lot of themes in this episode related to attachment. And that's that's never a controversial issue in Star Wars. Never ever. And the idea of choice and all of this. And I did like that theme of choice was pretty explicit throughout the episode. Even from the very first scene where I mentioned Cobb Vanth dumping the spice, he made that choice to dump something that was very valuable, something that could have allowed him to retire. But he has something more valuable that he's trying to protect. But then later on, we get it more in the context of the Jedi, and Grogu has a choice to make. And we're going to be talking a lot more about everything that's involved there, but I just thought that was a really nice through line throughout this episode. And then also, as long as I'm mentioning kind of the themes running through this particular episode, there was also a big theme about protection and protection, which is kind of rubbing up against this dichotomy between what it means to be a Jedi versus means to be Mandalorian. So we've got poor Din, who has traveled to see his baby, and he's brought him a present even, and he brought him little chainmail armor, which he says is meant to protect him, and he wants to give him this gift. He wants to see him, he wants to know that he's doing well, and he ultimately wants to know that the thing that's protecting him, his Beskar armor, is also going to be able to protect Grogu when he's not there. And when he ultimately decides not to see Grogu, again, another choice made in the episode, he gives it to Ahsoka and once again says, make sure he is protected. He really feels it's important that he knows that Grogu is protected. But what's really interesting is that by the time we get that. We've already seen Order 66. Again, this just kind of feels like a very typical Dave Filoni episode where we're going to see Order 66 every single way that we can. We still don't know who saved Grogu, but after he has his flashback, or Luke helps him remember, as he's coming out of that vision, Luke says the galaxy is a dangerous place, but I will help you protect yourself. And it's kind of setting up this dichotomy again between what it means to be Jedi, what it means to be Mandalorian, especially with the similar comparison that was made in the previous episode. Um, and again, this could have a little bit more nuance. It's pretty simplistic the way that they described it, but this idea of comparing and contrasting, the Jedi kind of reject attachment, and Din says that's the opposite of our creed, where we emphasize loyalty and solidarity. And I'll be curious to see what they do with that in the last episode, because clearly we have this little Grogu who he's got his connection to his Mandalorian father now, and I mean, he is a Jedi, and there's this question of who is going to protect him. Is he going to protect himself? Is he going to be protected by his father and by the armor that his father has given him, or is he, which choice is he going to make? Um, so those were just some themes that I saw running through protection, choice, that kind of stuff. But um, did you expect that we were going to be getting so much Jedi philosophy?
No, definitely not. I think I was expecting Cad Bane. That was what I was expecting from this, and they gave us like way more to dissect here. So
Yeah, just chock full. I mean, again, I think that you can ask whether or not this was the greatest place to get all of this new information, but it certainly kept me just riveted to my screen, seeing what they were introducing and whatnot. So, um, I guess now I'm going to turn it over to you. I know you've got lots of thoughts on everything that we got from the Jedi side of things. So you just go and you let me know when you want me to say anything more.
okay. Um well, yeah, this is a lot to take in, and a lot of the fan discussion has been revolving around the choice that Grogu was given at the end of this episode between either, taking the lightsaber and staying a Jedi, or training as a Jedi, and taking the chainmail and going back with Din. And I've seen people reading this multiple different ways, interpreting it multiple different ways. There are some people who were very upset about this because they don't like the implication that, oh, why is Luke holding to this idea that you have to let go of all of your emotional attachments to your friends and your family in order to be a Jedi? Isn't that the thing that actually helped him save Anakin in the end? And like, I understand it. And initially, upon my first watch of the episode, I had that kind of gut, like that knee jerk reaction of like, oh, this doesn't seem in line with what I know of Luke Skywalker, especially since he's not only my favorite character in Star Wars. I'm pretty sure he's my favorite character in all of fiction. So there's a lot of emotion tied into that character and how he's portrayed. I don't want to talk for 5 hours, so I'm going to try to get through these points as quickly as I can. But I've put together like a couple of possible ways to read into what's going on here, and I'm not going to say that any one of these is correct. But it's just, giving a few things for, I guess, people to think about and to consider what might possibly be going on here, and why this choice was in the episode, and why Luke seems to be portrayed the way that he was in this episode. And I guess I'll just get to it. The first thing that I kind of came up with is that, maybe he's operating under this assumption that you have to draw this very clear line between, you know, your obligations and your attachments to family and friends and your duty to the Jedi, is because this is the only perspective that has been handed down to him. All of the people that he's been mentored by were raised in the old Jedi Order. So, of course, that's kind of all that they knew. So, what else can they give him in the way of this is what it means to be a Jedi? Um, and I've talked about this before, how I think that a lot of these character arcs are paralleling each other. And I think that this goes back to how I feel like his storyline in trying to figure out what it means to be a Jedi, both individually and for the Jedi as a unit, is paralleling what Din is kind of going through in terms of trying to figure out what does it mean for him to be a Mandalorian, both individually, and what does that mean for them as a people as well. And we've seen Din start to incorporate alternate perspectives of what that means in, you know, encountering people like Bo-Katan, who live by a very different seemingly live by a very different creed than the one that he was personally raised in, that kind of challenges the way that he knows to be true. And so I've said before, I feel like, well, maybe Luke has to be challenged in that way as well. Maybe he needs to learn about other perspectives about what it means to be a Jedi and how to manage this particular issue in a way that might be a little bit different from what was done in the past. And what I came up with is I feel like he'd really benefit from meeting somebody like Ezra, because Ezra's upbringing as a Jedi Padawan was vastly different from those of the Padawans who were brought up in the temple before Order 66. He was raised by somebody who was a survivor of Order 66, but who hadn't completed his training because he was still fairly young when all of that went down. And, you know, Kanan is a guy who I kind of look at him and I see him as having one foot in the past and one foot in this uncharted territory of the future. And it's both him drawing upon what he was able to learn as a Padawan being trained at the temple, and also what he's kind of had to learn on his own without that institution guiding him. And ever since I started watching Rebels, I've kind of seen him and Ezra as sort of the bridge between what the Jedi were before, between like the old and the new, what might come with Luke. And it's interesting that Ezra's name is literally Ezra Bridger. I don't know if there's any significance to that or not. But in a way, I feel like it'd be interesting for Luke to learn that perspective and learn the story of, like, you know, Ezra's upbringing, how Kanan trained him, and specifically how Kanan was able to balance his duty to, you know, being a Jedi and training this Padawan and the responsibility of doing that, while also pretty much having this family. Like, the Ghost Crew was his family, and he had a relationship with Hera that we know resulted in a son, Jason, and even though he didn't live to raise him. And I don't think Luke has met anybody like that at this point, that has had this completely different experience in being raised as a Jedi, and it might be very enlightening for him and help him think about, you know, maybe there's, you know, potentially a different way to go about how we manage this relationship between vocational duty and the attachments that we do have to our loved ones, both for family and, you know, romantic relationships. And speaking of Kanan specifically, in a way, I almost kind of see him as a prototype for what Luke could be, or at least posing the question of, do we go back to what the Jedi did before Kanan and Ezra, or do we use the example of Kanan and Ezra as a jumping off point to do something slightly different moving forward in the future. And again, I just think it would be interesting for Luke to have that perspective to consider, to take into account. And what I find interesting in terms of, this term attachment that gets thrown around, there is an episode at the beginning of Rebels. I think it's in season 1, and I can't remember which episode. I think it's the one about Empire Day, where Kanan is training Ezra to establish a bond with this very cranky Lothcat that doesn't want to have anything to do with this. And Ezra, he's just not having it. He's not having a good day. And Kanan literally tells him that you need to learn to attach to other living beings and open yourself up to being emotionally vulnerable, or you will never be a Jedi, which I think is a really interesting thing to consider, because I think that a lot of people who take this attachment thing to be very literal, of like, you cannot have emotional connections, or at the very least it's like you have to really distance yourself from them, if then that's their view of attachment. Like, this is like completely contradictory to that. And I think that's just an interesting thing for him to have taught, and an interesting thing for Luke to potentially learn. So
Yeah, I think that you bring up some really good points just with this first interpretation that you're going through. Um, also, I'd never thought about the significance of Ezra being named Bridger. That is really interesting, and I definitely can see where he literally is that link between the old ways and the potential of the new. Um, the other thing that I was thinking about as you were talking about this is just kind of how much Luke still has to learn. And that's something that you just think about the way that people react, have been reacting to this episode. And but then when you think about just how young in his own journey Luke still is, and the fact that he's having to do so much on his own, and now potentially with the help of Ahsoka and whatever he's getting from the forced ghosts that he knows. um I really think too that um what do, how does Luke view attachment? We just really don't know. And obviously you've done a lot of reading into the EU books and seen how his idea of the tenets of Jedi philosophy kind of evolve and become something a little bit different from what the previous generations had seen. But it just strikes me that we really need to allow Luke Skywalker to be a character who is still evolving in and of himself. I think that a lot of people um i- they want Luke to be pretty much a plaster saint. They want him to be pretty firm in his convictions, and I think that people get a little bit uncomfortable. Um, and I'm not going to say that's not unjustified, depending on what you thought of the sequels, but um, I just think that it's important to remember that he is still very young. He's still learning a lot. I've even thought, that with this hard dichotomy, does Luke himself know anything about Tarre Vizsla? He's never received classes in Jedi history or Jedi Mandalorian relations. He likely doesn't know that there was a Jedi who was both Jedi and Mandalorian, not just a Mandalorian, but the Mandalore, somebody who had direct responsibility for his people. So, um, just as you continue, I really like this idea that, we need to keep in mind that Luke is still young, he's still evolving. His thoughts on certain issues definitely are going to be fluid as well.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with that, and I'm gonna touch on it a little bit later when I go into one of these other interpretations. But yeah, I don't think that he needs to be a static character right now, especially if they want to continue utilizing more, then he should have some sort of an arc. And it looks like they do kind of want to utilize him more. So if he's just perfect, then there's nowhere for him to go. So I'm open to him growing as a character. Um, but I guess just one more point on this with Kanan. I do think that it'll also be interesting potentially to have Luke also possibly meet Hera and Jason and actually see like the living proof of this relationship. And I was thinking about this earlier today about how there's a very fascinating parallel there between Luke being the son of a Jedi and Jason being the son of a Jedi. Um, like I just think that that would be I would love to see that meeting go down on screen. I don't know if we'll get that, but I do think that there's a significance to Kanan's legacy as a Jedi that I haven't really seen very many people taking into account when it comes to this. And knowing that Filoni is largely going to be helming the Ahsoka series and that may touch on that, I'm wondering, how much that's going to get factored into things, and I would like to see it being addressed in some way. Um, so I'm going to move on to the next sort of potential reading of this scene, or just in general Luke as a character in this episode. And this one, maybe it's more of a matter of Luke not having as much of a personal investment in this kind of choice between this vocational duty and these emotional attachments, because, well, the situation that he's in right now, at least in terms with his family, it's not like he's part of this the intimate day-to-day details of Han and Leia's family unit. And not necessarily that he needs to be. He's the brother, he's the brother-in-law, he's, I framed it as like the cool uncle who shows up for holidays and birthdays and family dinners and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, he's single, he's a bachelor who's got, he's got his job, and he has more space and time and energy to devote to that and find the balance between that and, still keeping and maintaining his relationships with family, with friends. And that's very different from being a spouse or being a parent or something like that, which that requires much more of a commitment there. And the only other person I could say who really would maybe demand that much of a commitment would be Anakin, but unfortunately, Anakin's passed on, and I think that even though he's a Force ghost, I think that the relationship between them is it's not the same as if his father were alive. And even then, Luke's an adult, and we all know the relationship between an adult child and their parent there is some level of detachment, so to speak, there versus a child who is still a child and their parent. Again, the level of commitment is different. But and I'm not the only person who's mentioned this, so this is not just me with all my wishful thinking, but I think that if you had him being challenged with a very strong personal attachment that came in there that might require a deeper level of commitment there, that could run the risk of compromising his commitment to rebuilding the Jedi, like that could be another catalyst for him to rethink the idea of like, well, there has to be this clear distinction between this is my duty and this is, these are my emotional connections with people, and I can only choose to really fully dedicate my time to one or the other. And I'm not saying this is going to happen, so don't everybody get their hopes up and think this is going to 100% happen, because it may not. But I'm just saying, narratively speaking, I think it's an actual justifiable way to incorporate Mara if that's what they wanted to do with this, and not have it feel super contrived. Because I think that the question with this character and potentially bringing her into this storyline would be not so much, how do we explain her being there? It would be more of like, well, what do we do with her going forward? Because you can fit her in. There's this whole backstory set up by Clone Wars and Rebels of Palpatine was taking Force sensitive kids, training them, apparently, according to some of the tie-in material, to be spies. That's very much in line with her backstory in the EU. Real easy, just fit her in, say she's one of those kids. Where does the story go from there? You can't just stick a character in there and just be like, well, they're here now. What do they do? So if you had her playing into this idea that you're really challenging Luke in a very personal way, where he's being faced with this kind of choice himself of like, I don't know if I want to choose one or the other, and potentially he might know what happened with Anakin and his mom, and being afraid that like this is, if I let myself have a relationship with this person, is it going to end in a dumpster fire like it did with my dad? Or swing the other way, where it's kind of like Obi-Wan and Satine, where he goes like, well, I have my duty and I have to give that up, even though I wish that I could be with this person. Like, it'd be an interesting way of challenging him in that way, and getting him to think, well, is there a way to walk a road between these two things? And it'd be interesting if, as well as if you could add the whole story of Kanan and Hera on top of that, where he actually has an example of this working successfully in the past, and maybe that could ease some of his fears on it. So
Yeah, it's really interesting that you bring up that Kanan did have a relationship with Hera, and again, like you said, his life as a Jedi looks very, very different from anybody before him. But you know, his story, we saw him sacrificing himself. Would he have been as willing to sacrifice Hera? Probably not. So that's something that I've never really thought about, what level of attachment are we working with in Kanan and Hera's story. But you're absolutely right that Kanan and Ezra are really important characters, even if we're just looking at them kind of as archetypal examples of things that Luke needs to be wrestling with and needs to be seeing that he probably has no idea about right now, because Luke cannot exist in the way that the prequel era Jedi did. But he also has to be the one to wrestle with these things and kind of find that via media. He has to be the one who if there is a middle way to find, he has to be the one to find it. And that's, I'm sure, incredibly daunting, but that really is his duty right now, as he's trying to figure out what this school is going to look like. The fact that he knows, probably even at this point in the timeline, he likely knows that his nephew is going to be a student of his. These are all things that he's got to wrestle with, that a lot of prequel era Jedi probably never had to.
yeah, and I definitely agree. I think that there's a lot of pressure there, because he's the one who has to set the example, like whatever he decides. And you brought a really good point up about that. And honestly, I could even see him holding himself to a higher standard than anybody else. We don't know, if when he's going to meet Ezra, and if Ezra is going to be a part of what he's doing with the Jedi, or who else is going to come into the mix. But could it be a deal where he realizes, well, we can be more flexible with everybody else who's training Jedi, or training to become a Jedi, but I'm going to hold myself to a higher standard because I'm the one in charge and I cannot afford to be vulnerable to anything. And could that potentially be a problem for him, or something that he needs to possibly work past? Yeah, so I don't know. I think there's some pretty fascinating possibilities that can come out of this. Again, like you said earlier, this is all a learning experience for him, so it might all of these things together might need to factor into how he moves forward. And I think that it would be interesting if they did something like this to really see the contrast between how he would deal with a romantic relationship versus how his predecessors dealt with that, and see it's like what's similar, what's different, what can he learn from what he knows of both, what went wrong and what went right. Like I've always thought that that would be an interesting thing to explore with him. And what's interesting is in terms of his relationship with Mara in the EU, a lot of that was developing at the time that the prequels were developing, and so they kind of had to, alter things as these movies were coming out, and so obviously some things don't entirely match up. But in one of the books where it's a Vision of the Future by Timothy Zahn, which is the book that's most famous for getting Luke and Mara together officially. There is a part in the book where they're infiltrating this base on the outskirts of the galaxy, and she goes off to investigate something on her own, and he suddenly loses track of her through the Force and momentarily freaks out, and he almost goes into Anakin mode because he gets very upset about this. And then the thing that actually stops him from doing that is, I would argue, his romantic attachment to her, because he thinks to himself, she would not want me to do this, and therefore I'm not going to go berserk and kill a bunch of people. And because that gives him pause, he's able to figure out later on the actual reason why he can't sense her through the Force, which is not that she's dead, it's that the room that she went into was blocked off from the Force, and that was it. So I think it's just interesting, and like another example of how those bonds that you have with people can make you stronger in a way. It's just, it really just depends on how you approach them, and how you deal with them, because he kind of does that in Return of the Jedi, where he has this bond with Leia that is really the trigger point for why he decides to start really going after Vader. But then there's also this bond that he started to develop with his father, and it's about him finding really that balance between these emotional connections that he has and figuring out the best way to walk the path of the Jedi without those emotions really taking over him. And it's like he still has the emotional component, he still has those emotional connections, but he's the one in control of them as opposed to them controlling him, which I think is very different from Anakin's experience, where I think he kind of ended up falling into this trap of his emotions were controlling and driving a lot of his behavior. And maybe Luke doesn't consciously realize that he's already found a balance between these two things, because when you're experiencing something in the moment, you kind of don't, a lot of times, like, you don't really realize the significance of it until somebody else points it out to you, or you go back and reflect on it, and maybe that's what he needs to do as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you kind of pull out the practical ways that Luke sees attachment in his life. We didn't even really we started this conversation, and I'm such a bad history student because we didn't define our terms. We didn't really seek to figure out what exactly attachment means in this situation, and honestly, that's probably a good thing because um it's a nebulous entity. It's something that a lot of people struggle to define, and a lot of people and even authors, creators have misdefined in throughout the years. And um but I think that we can all agree that there is definitely a big difference between um a situation like you just recounted with Luke, where it's like, that worry, that concern, but ultimately being able to keep those emotions under control for the greater good, and even for the person that they're concerned about, in order to actually, not fly off the handle, which was always Anakin's problem. Um, but while we're kind of still talking about this issue, I did want to read one source, just because I know that um a lot of people bring different mentalities based on what they've consumed about Star Wars. And so, and one of the perspectives that a lot of people don't spend a lot of time identifying or considering is basically just what George Lucas has said on the topic before. And so I did just think, like, this would be a good thing to read, and now read in, as we still have these images of Anakin and Padme, of Obi-Wan and Satine, of Kanan and Hera, and now of Luke and Mara, and just kind of seeing how attachment is able to factor in to the lives of the Jedi. So this is just a passage um, that comes from the original trilogy's archive book, and it's a conversation between George Lucas and Paul Duncan, and they're talking about, at this point, when Luke in A New Hope goes back to the homestead, and he finds that Owen and Beru have been killed. And Obi-Wan, George Lucas says that Obi-Wan lets him do that. He needs to see that he kind of has um nothing else keeping him on Tatooine anymore. And then it goes into this conversation about what exactly attachment means. So George Lucas says, he believes the iron cage is closed. I can't get out. Well, try the door before you say that. The cage door is open. And Paul Duncan says, as a child, you grow attached to your family, but there's a point where you must make the decision to leave. And George says, Jedi Knights get taken from their families very young. They do not grow attachments because attachment is a path to the dark side. You can love people, but you can't want to possess them. They're not yours, except that they have a fate. Even those you love most are going to die. You can't do anything about that. Protect them with your lightsaber, but if they die, they were going to die. There's nothing you can do. All you can do is accept that fact. In mythology, if you go to Hades to get them back, you're not doing it for them, you're doing it for yourself. You're doing it because you don't want to give them up. You're afraid to be without them. The key to the dark side is fear. You must be clean of fear, and fear of loss is the greatest fear. If you're set up for fear of loss, you will do anything to keep that loss from happening, and you're going to end up in the dark side. That's the basic premise of Star Wars and the Jedi, and how it works. That's why they're taken at a young age to be trained. They cannot get themselves killed trying to save their best buddy when it's a hopeless exercise. And Paul Duncan says, it sounds like a very lonely thing. And George says, not if you're not afraid. A Jedi is never lonely. They live on compassion. They live on helping people, and people love them. They can love people back. And then he goes on to say, but if that person dies, it doesn't define them. It doesn't change the way that they live. They let them go. And that definitely is it definitely illuminates the differences in the way that attachment had a hold of Anakin versus the way that we see it in Luke's life, in Obi-Wan's life, in and probably even in Kanan's life as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really great thing to bring up. I mean, obviously people have interpreted it differently from George's original meaning. And I would even say, like, in universe, that there are, Jedi who might take it differently and kind of apply it differently, and that maybe that might have been one of the problems, is that there isn't this clarity of, like, what does this actually mean? And maybe that's what Luke needs to figure out, so that he's the one who can go, this is what it actually means, and this is what we're going to do with it. Like, maybe there was a lot of confusion in the past, and this was a flaw of what was done before, and so that is the thing that needs to be fixed. And like you said earlier, I think he's still learning. I think that he's still figuring a lot of this out. And that being said, I think that also, there are certain things in the post Lucas era of Star Wars that have kind of, I want to say, deviated a little bit from his original intent with some things. So I can see this going down a bit of a different path than how he originally saw it. I'm not a person who's like super upset about the possibility of that happening. I think it's only kind of natural when you have new people who take over. They bring their own ideas and things to the table. And I mean, it'd be interesting to see exactly how it's being interpreted here. I'm hoping that we get more of an elaboration on that, and especially on how Luke himself is interpreting it. Because again, like, it may be that is the real idea of what it's supposed to mean, but the people who've received this teaching may not have really understood that. So it's very possible that Ahsoka, the way that she was taught, like, doesn't have that full understanding of what it means. And so then what she's passing on to Luke is based off of her personal experience and personal interpretation of what this means and what it means to be a Jedi. And of course, again, he's somebody who doesn't really have a lot of information to go off of right now, other than what he's been told by the people who are mentoring him or have mentored him. But I'm going to go into the next kind of reading of the scene, which is a little bit, I wouldn't say completely opposite of the previous two talking points, but it's a little bit of a different way of looking at what's going on with the choice, with Luke's attitude towards attachment and what have you. And I think there's an argument that can be made that he's already kind of started either, I mean, some people would see it as moving away from the old teachings. I would say it is more of like reinterpreting them, or like just, reworking some of what he understands of the old ways as relayed to him, probably from Ahsoka. And the first thing that I want to highlight is, this is a little bit of a side note, but I want to talk about Ahsoka's behavior towards Din when he first comes to see Grogu. Because there were a lot of people who were thrown off by this, and they have read it as kind of like, this is a little bit mean, like, you're not going to let him see him, like, why wouldn't you let him do that, and why does it have to be this whole thing of Padawan versus foundling, and this is unfair. And what I'm going to do to explain this the way that I see it is bring in some of my personal experience, having worked with kids, worked in education and childcare, because it gave me an alternative perspective on what might actually be going on here, that some people may not have heard from other people talking about this topic. So I actually honestly saw a very strong parallel between her behavior towards Din and telling him, don't, you can't go up and see him right now because it's going to make things very difficult for him. I saw a parallel between that and how, a lot of teachers, a lot of people in childcare, when the kids are coming to school for the first time, they actually encourage the parents to not hover around. you do not want to stick around for too long. You want to say your goodbye and you want to leave, and not leave like I'm going to leave the room and hang outside the door, like literally leave the premises and get out of there. And this seems very harsh probably to people who have not had experience from this. It might seem very harsh to first time parents who are going through this kind of thing for the first time. Like, why would you want us to get out of there? um well, the thing is if you have a parent who is constantly hovering around trying to make sure that their kid is okay and that they're adjusting well, that actually a lot of times tends to make the adjustment more difficult for that child, because they get very clingy. They kind of get a sense that something is off, that mom or dad is, it might leave, and then they start kind of getting very grabby and more emotional. And it just, once the parent does have to leave, it becomes much worse, not just for the teachers to deal with that kid's inevitable breakdown, but also it's just more distressing for the child. So when they're in that adjustment window, um and they're in like a new environment, they need that space from the parent to be able to adjust, because they have to be able to acclimate to the environment with the understanding that mom and dad are not going to be here, and I need to wait for them to come back, and I'm still safe, I'm still okay, but this is different, and they have to get used to that, and they can't get used to it if the parent is constantly hanging around them, like checking out. It's like, are they doing okay, what's going on? And it's just speaking from that side of the fence, it does get a little bit annoying for those of us working there when you have a parent that's constantly intruding and just being like, what's my kid doing, or like, how are they? And it's just like they won't leave, and you're just sitting there going like, I can't say anything because it's unprofessional, but they really need to get out of here. um and I, and honestly, I think that it's also helpful for like the teachers and for like the people working with these kids to to have that separation, so that they can really evaluate whether the child is actually adjusting properly. And you can't get as an objective of a view of that if the parent is always there. And so with this in mind, I actually think that she and Luke did the right thing. It wasn't so much of like, you can never see him again. It was more of, he's adjusting right now. You need to let him have the space to see if he can adjust. And I think that that really helped Luke be able to evaluate later on, whether or not Grogu was having an issue with this adjustment, and to evaluate, is he acclimating properly, or is that not happening? And I don't think that that would have been possible had Din been allowed to hang around.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I really like the way that you talk about the positives of what Ahsoka was trying to do, because um I do really see especially a lot of young people responding very negatively to this idea that like they're he came all this way, they're keeping his child from him. And the thing is that um this is where that theme of choice comes back in, because Ahsoka asks Din, are you going to see him because of him, or because this is something that you need? And that's exactly the same thing that I suspect you could probably ask the parents who hang around. Are you here because you're truly worried about your child? Or are you here because you need that reassurance that everything is okay, and you're willing to make it harder for your kid in order to have that reassurance for yourself? I I really feel like the backlash to several different things in this episode, including Din not seeing Grogu and the choice that Grogu is given. When I see people kind of be like, well, why is this happening? Why does it have to be such a dichotomy? It really makes me feel like, I mean, again, this is a generalization. It doesn't characterize everybody, but I feel like I typically am seeing those kinds of thoughts from people who are younger. And I know that for me, as I've gotten older, one of the things that's been both hard to learn but also necessary is that you can't have it all. And so, that we can talk about that a little bit later, in terms of like the purpose behind the choice that Luke gives to Grogu. But I just think that like I think that Ahsoka's desire to really establish like why is Din here? Why, and what does he need? And she lets him see him. He can see that Grogu is absolutely fine, and he's learning, and he's doing exactly what he came there to do, and exactly what Din set out, um right from season 1. He was on this journey to get him back with his kind, and he is. But I just think that, as you get older, you learn that there isn't always the ability to have it all. And so choice ultimately becomes a sense of freedom as opposed to limitation. And I think that Din needs to learn that. And like I said, the whole crux of this episode is that Grogu has to learn that too.
Um, yeah, I mean that's a really good point to bring up. And yeah, I don't think that any of us like having choices presented to us where it's like we have to make a big decision. A lot of times we would rather just be like, well, let me just give me all the
Have it all.
things.
Yep.
But yeah, I would introduce like an extra level of nuance to that though, because there was something that I was told while I was taking a theater class many years ago. Well, not that long ago. I'm framing it like I'm super old, but but there was a woman in this class that I was in, and I don't know what this was in relation to. It might have been in relation to the play that we were reading, and I can't really remember the specifics. But she had said something that stuck with me ever since I heard it, which is you can have it all, just not at the same time. And that was very illuminating to me because I think that that's something that we all get faced with much of the time. Like, we want this thing now, but we also want this other thing now. And maybe, yeah, you could have both of those things, but maybe you're not going to have both of them at exactly the same time. And there's some interpretations of what's going on here, at least theories of what may happen in terms of Grogu's choice that um could connect to that, which I'll get into a little bit later. But I think that's a interesting addition to bring to what you've said about choice and the responsibility of making them. Um, and I do like that you brought up again the fact that Ahsoka is really trying to evaluate, is this about what Grogu needs versus is this about what Din needs or what Din wants. And with that, I'm kind of going to segue into the next point about this is that, again, I don't think that either she or Luke are being emotionally cold or distant with Din or Grogu. I think that they're taking specifically Grogu's needs into account. And I want to say that Luke is actually pretty attentive to Grogu's needs, particularly his emotional needs. And this was something that it took me a little bit of reflection and looking at other people's opinions on the ending of the episode to really come around to recognizing. But again, once I noticed it, I kind of connected it to some of my experiences having worked with kids, worked in pre-K for many years, and that Luke is actually impressively, for someone who has no teaching experience, doing a really good job of this, because he very quickly notices that Grogu's heart may not be in the training. He brings it up to Ahsoka instead of kind of just brushing it under the rug and letting it sit. He doesn't make this assumption that, well, if he's struggling now, he'll just he'll probably get over it, right? Like he doesn't do that. He recognizes there's a problem here and is starting to ask himself the question, what do I do to meet this student's needs, which is exactly what a good teacher should do. And this was the thing that made me the most emotional once I kind of sat and thought with it, because it's like I've been both on the teacher end of it and the student end of it. And I really think that that's a mark of him maybe being, trying to take steps to be a little bit different from what may have occurred with his father. And it's not that I don't think that the Jedi Council like cared about him. I think that, Obi-Wan, I think, definitely cared about him. At the very least, you could say that there was more of a personal connection there. I mean, he does call him his brother. Um, but I think that there were some aspects to his character where it kind of feels like he was the quote unquote problem student who was struggling with some things that sort of got addressed, but then maybe didn't get addressed as fully as they could have, especially in terms of like, his attachment to his mother, his fear of loss. Like, it's kind of like, well, we'll just have these surface level discussions about it, but never really, go into, let's work with this person to help him overcome with this. And I see that there, you could potentially draw a parallel between that and somebody, a kid who is struggling in school or something like that. And I really do honestly hesitate to use the term problem student because I don't like labeling kids, but for lack of a better way of putting it, that's kind of what I see from Anakin. And I think that there may have been this attitude of just they were so busy with all this other stuff going on that a lot of his struggle to adjust to this Jedi lifestyle and adjust to finding that balance between, all these things that we've talked about already kind of went under the radar a little bit until it was too late. And you have Luke here taking the initiative to immediately identify my student is struggling, particularly emotionally, and he takes the initiative to address it very quickly. And again, that's a really great mark of a good teacher, that if you're able to, and you do notice that somebody's having an issue, a good teacher typically is not going to just put it on the back burner and say, well, maybe they'll be fine. They're going to hone in on it and then kind of figure out, observe that kid, figure out, is there something that can be done? Like, do we have resources to help this child? Because if you let it sit, the behavior could become more unmanageable. Their progress could really dip, and there could be more problems down the line. So I think that he's actually doing a fairly good job with what little experience he has in terms of being a teacher.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add with that other than the fact that, I also worked in a school for a year and not as in depth and directly with the students as I think you have, but yeah, I think that when you view what we got in this episode through that lens, um I just think that the decisions that were being made in this episode make a lot more sense than they might have just on the surface, where it just kind of feels like, um I see a lot of people who are accusing Luke of falling into the same potential abuses or neglectful practices, or I don't know, however people are perceiving the the actions of the Jedi Council in relation to Anakin. Um there's just there's a lot to say there, but I definitely like the images that you've used from your own life in order to talk about what we got in this episode.
Um, yeah, I just think I just thought that was an interesting way of looking at it, because I don't think that Luke's being cruel. Like, he's just trying to
No.
do the best that he can with the resources that he has available to him. And anybody who's been in that situation where you've been working with kids or teaching, that's what you do. And we know that he has kind of limited resources because he only has a certain amount of knowledge from the people who've taught him, and so that's what he's kind of going off of. um And to jump off that, I think that the fact that he figures out that maybe the way to go is to give Grogu this choice to determine his his own destiny, or being informed by what he's learned of the past. And of course, like, I think that a lot of that he's getting that through Ahsoka's lens. And we know that Ahsoka, her experience in the Jedi Order did not end very well, that she, became very disillusioned with the Jedi, and had, experiences outside of that kind of tipped her off to the fact that maybe there were some things going on with the order that needed to be tweaked or addressed, that she felt like they weren't addressing. And there's this sense of, um I don't know how to describe it, but there's this somber aspect to her attitude towards having been raised in the Jedi all of her life, near the end of Clone Wars season 7, where she's talking to Rex about, like, this is the only life she's ever known. And that for that whole time she's been a soldier, and it's like she's never, until she left, like, she never knew anything outside of that. And so maybe her idea of, you know the Jedi practices of how they recruit people were very soured by that reflection of her experience. And again, is that, was what they did, like, evil in terms of taking children so young? I wouldn't frame it that way, but I can understand why people have problems with it, both in and out of universe, because they're, these kids are so young, they haven't really had any time to experience anything outside of this life. And when they get old enough to kind of go, through the trials or whatever, is the choice to be a Jedi really a choice? Like, how can you choose something when that's all you've ever known? Like, is it a real, truly informed choice, or is there an imbalance there? And maybe that's something that she noticed and thought was a problem with the way they had done things before. Maybe she's relayed that to Luke, and so Luke is potentially taking this into account and thinking, well, maybe Grogu assumes that he has to stay in this life because that was how he was raised. He was raised in the temple, but maybe, you know, maybe he doesn't realize that it's okay for him to choose something else, especially now that he's had an outside experience, experiencing stuff outside of his upbringing in the Jedi Temple. He shouldn't just push that aside because that was the way he was initially raised. He should take that experience into account and really have the chance to evaluate, which lifestyle do I think fits me better. And when you look at it that way, what Luke is doing for him is actually, I think is really commendable. Like, he's giving him the chance to really think about what he wants out of his life, and to take these different experiences into account, and to actually have a choice that feels like a real choice, that's an informed choice, not just of the Jedi life versus the life that you might have with Din Djarin, but then also the idea of commitment. I've heard several people bringing this up about, like, it's less about attachment and more about commitment, and I think that this could be very, very true. He wants Grogu to be aware that when you make a commitment to the Jedi, this is a really big deal. Like, it's going to entail a lot of hard work, it's going to entail a lot of sacrifice. Do you think that you're really up for doing that? And it's not so much of a challenge of, like, do you think you can do that, or are you strong enough to do that kind of thing. It's more of like, is your heart going to be able to commit to that? And I would compare it to people deciding to commit to a relationship or commit to having kids. You should not be going into that not really understanding the potential ramifications of choosing that commitment, because once you get into that, it can be very hard to exit it, especially when there's children in the picture. And it's I know plenty of stories of where that has gone awry, and you don't want to commit to yourself to something without really thinking about what that commitment might entail and whether or not you're up to doing that. And maybe the at least going off of what he may have learned from Ahsoka, maybe the information that he has of how the old Jedi Order used to do things, maybe there's this idea that the people that they recruited in the past didn't, they were too young to have enough of an understanding of like what it really means to be committed to this life. And because they were raised in the temple and didn't really know very much outside of it, even if they could make a choice later on, like, I'm going to continue being a Jedi, maybe it wasn't as informed of a choice as it potentially could have been. So Luke's opening the door and saying, like, I'm giving you all of the information so that you can really look at this and know exactly what you're deciding to do, as opposed to kind of sort of having a more fuzzy understanding of what's really what's going on here. And I think that it may be also informed by the fact that maybe Anakin felt a little bit trapped by his obligation as the chosen one. Like, even if maybe he wanted to leave and be with Padme, he potentially felt like he couldn't because, well, I'm the chosen one. They've told me I'm the chosen one. They're expecting me to live up to this. And it's that burden of expectation. And I think what Luke could be doing here, he's taking the burden of expectation away and saying, I'm not expecting you to continue this life just because you were raised in the temple. Like, you actually have the freedom to decide what your destiny is here. What do you think is best for you?
Yeah, I think that's basically the crux of this entire episode. And while there are reasons why I feel like I would have liked a more nuanced portrayal of some of these philosophical issues, I really, really do love that the idea of choice is so prevalent throughout the whole thing, and ending with that choice for Grogu. I think that a lot of people are reacting negatively because Grogu looks like a baby and he acts like a baby and he sounds like a baby. The thing is that yes, there we have to take in the idea that like he's at a younger mental state than a 50-year-old who is a human, but this is someone who has already been trained. He's already had a lot of knowledge and experience, and he's had both the Jedi experience and an outsider's experience. And so the thing is that I think a lot of people are looking at this and going, that's like giving a baby a decision. You can't do that. But no, in actuality, this is a lot more like Obi-Wan having to make the decision to either stay with Satine or not. And ultimately, that decision wasn't his to make because she never asked. But it was at that stage in his life when he had been raised in the Jedi, had experienced that life, but then also, just like Grogu, experiences something else, something outside of the order, and realizes that I don't have to commit to being a Jedi Knight if I don't want to. And the fact that he is willing to say that, he's willing to say, I was ready to leave if you had asked. It brings to mind the fact that the Jedi have never been a prison. We do know, we get ideas of like the Lost 20, which were like 20 masters who left the order. But again, a master is somebody who has already committed themselves to the path of the Jedi several times before. We know that there are the trials that the Padawans go through, and we know that knights have to, complete many years in just of missions and education and all these things in order to become a master. And there's so much that, yes, I would, kind of like what you were saying, like, is a choice to commit to the culture that you've been raised in, is it really a choice because that's all you know? I mean, there definitely is a societal expectation that comes with that, but I think it's just really important to emphasize, because so many people miss it, that the Jedi are not a prison for the people inside of it. And for Grogu, Luke is making it very clear that if he doesn't want to be there, he does not have to stay. And he even tells Ahsoka, I don't know if his heart's in it. If that's the case, then there is no shame in him leaving. And I wish that people would kind of recognize that too. Like, there's this special nature of being force sensitive, but being a Jedi is just a job. It's just a job title. It's something that people, you do make a commitment to it, but there is nothing that says if you're force sensitive, you must be a Jedi. And thus, there's nothing to say that if you're not a Jedi, if you decide not to be one, that you're somehow um denying yourself in that moment. And so this episode really has set up this really interesting um dichotomy between what do you choose, like when you've experienced both sides of something, but you really can't have it all. Luke knows that Grogu can either commit to being a Jedi now and remain in that lifestyle, or he can go back to Din and enjoy that relationship for a while, but then not be a Jedi because of the attachment that's going to come with it. It- this is a choice that Grogu has to make. It probably is kind of the exception to what I think is a really good rule, like you said, that you can't have it all. You just can't always have it all at the same time. In this case, the thing that really strikes me is that Anakin was very afraid to lose Padme, but Luke knows that Grogu is going to have to lose Din. He either can lose him now and be a Jedi, or he can be with him for a while and then lose him in a couple of decades. Grogu will still be very young, and Grogu will still have much of his life beyond Din. So, I don't know. I just think that, yeah, this is a very complicated situation, but at the end of the day, like, this does all really line up with the philosophy of what it means to be a Jedi Knight. And Grogu just has to decide which vocational path he wants to take.
Um, yeah. And I mean, to go off of this about, Luke being aware of the fact that Grogu will have to let go of Din in the end, either now or later. I like that it seems to be that he is taking that into account as well. And I think that that's potentially being influenced by both like his relationship with Anakin, and as well as maybe he's learned the story of Anakin and Shmi, where, you know, there was this uncertainty if he was going to see her again. And then when he saw her again, it was, pretty much it was too late. And it was kind of a similar deal with Luke. Like once he was able to break through to Anakin, and Anakin turned back to the light, well, Anakin sacrifices himself to save him, and he dies. And Luke never got the chance to really have that relationship with his father while he was alive, and he missed out on growing up with him as well. And I think even then it's still of a different experience from what Leia went through, because at least Leia had adoptive parents. Luke always knew that the people who were raising him were not his parents. They were his aunt and his uncle, and he was very aware of this fact, which is why he's always, asking questions about his dad. And he missed out on that experience. And I would venture to say that that is a very deep wound for him that's probably, never going to fully heal. And he's very aware of that, from a personal standpoint, I would say. And so again, I think it's a courtesy for him to encourage Grogu to really think about his own relationship with Din, and what he wants to do moving forward, because Luke knows that that time that you have with your loved ones, it's limited. You don't have an unlimited amount of time with the people that you love, and you may need to take the opportunity to spend that time while you still have it. And I think he wants Grogu to really take that into consideration of like if you really love this person and you're invested in this relationship with them, then maybe the best thing for you to do is to go and spend time with them while you still have that time to spend. Because Luke knows that from personal experience that you cannot get that time back. He lost that time. He can't get it back. Grogu still has that time. So again, he's giving him a window of opportunity there to go after this if this is what he really wants. And I just want to point out that he says, you may never see the Mandalorian again. It's not like you can't see him or I'm forbidding you from seeing him. He's just trying to make him aware of the fact that this is training to be a Jedi. It's going to take up a lot of your time and your energy, and you may not have the time to spend with him in the way that you want to. And you really have to evaluate, is that a risk that you're willing to take here? Because like I said, once the time is gone, you cannot get that back. And I think to kind of generalize all of what's going on here, I think that it's very Luke, because he's basically telling Grogu to follow where his heart is leading him, essentially. Like, where do you feel like your heart is leading you? Like, what is that telling you? You know, where do you think the Force might be leading you? Because it might not be leading him to train with him as a Jedi, and he's encouraging him to really listen to that. And that's very in line with how Luke behaves in the original trilogy. I think that he's somebody who's always kind of been a heart first, head later type of person. And so when you look at it this way, this is actually really in character for him. Specifically when it came to you trying to save his dad, like nobody really understood this decision, but he just kept justifying it, saying this, like, I have to go. Like, he just felt like that was where he needed to be, and so he followed his heart in that respect. And we all know how that turned out. And so I think that Luke, the way that he teaches is very experienced based. And I was actually having a conversation with somebody about like Luke and Ahsoka and teaching styles, and I think that his teaching style is very rooted in what does my personal experience tell me about the best course of action to take in certain situations. And so he's drawing on that experience to teach Grogu, because from his experience he sees a lot of value in following your heart, in kind of evaluating like where do you really feel like you're meant to be. And so I think that in that way he's trying to pass on, so to speak, what he's learned to his student and tell him, really look inside of yourself. Where is that little needle pointing towards? And it feels very almost like Qui-Gon to me, in a way of just like following the will of the Force and that kind of thing, because sometimes the Force does lead you into a weird direction. Like we saw that in A New Hope, where Obi-Wan, his ghost is telling him like just connect to the Force. It's like, turn off your computer, and it's just sort of like, this makes zero sense, but he ultimately ends up trusting in it and going with that, and the Death Star is destroyed as a result. And again, based on his personal experience, he sees there's a lot of value in this, and so he's trying to get Grogu to see this as well, because again, the thing that wherever his heart actually lies is the thing that he's going to be the most committed to. If his heart is not in it, then it's just sort of like he's forcing himself, and I don't think that Luke wants him to do that.
I completely agree. This is definitely like I said, there's no failure in stepping away from the Jedi Order if you don't want to be a Jedi. There's nothing that says you must. I think that it is good that he's being trained, but um this is just obviously something that is going to be a huge part of Grogu's story. I mean, this is literally the fork in the road type of moment where, in one universe he could make one decision, and in another he makes the opposite one. So I don't know. It'll be really interesting to see, though.
Yeah. And I think that uh honestly, what's interesting to me, and this is kind of like my final really big point, is that uh I feel like thematically Filoni might be drawing a lot from some of this EU material, specifically stuff that Timothy Zahn has written. And I know that he's talked a little bit about, how big of an influence that, that original Thrawn trilogy was for, him and other fans back in the 90s. And I think that there's a lot factoring into how characters approach these kinds of philosophies and how they behave, that it pulls from some of those books more so than some people may have noticed. This idea of choice and consequence is a really big factor in Luke and Mara's storyline, and not just in those original 3 books, but also some of the books that come later. And how he poses the idea of choosing your destiny to Mara in the earlier books, and then how he himself has to evaluate his own attitude towards other people's choices and decisions, um when he kind of gets caught up in the idea of like, well, it's my responsibility to help everybody and save everybody, and that kind of infringes on other people's freedom to choose or make decisions for themselves. And there's actually a quote from the book that I mentioned earlier, Vision of the Future, and where, just to quickly summarize it, Mara has to make this very big decision for herself in terms of making a personal sacrifice that's really difficult for her to do. And Luke's initial gut reaction to this is like, well, I have to do something about it to fix this. And one of the big conflicts that they have in this book is her being a little bit upset at him, or maybe kind of a lot upset at him, for the fact that, like, even though his heart's in the right place, sometimes he can go too far with trying to help people, trying to fix things. And she's trying to get him to realize, like, sometimes you need to pull back and let people not only make their decisions and make their mistakes if that's what they're going to do, but also let them embrace the responsibility of making their own choices. Um, and there's this quote here that I really love, where it says, he could hate it, he could bitterly oppose it, but down deep he knew she was right. The universe wasn't his responsibility. Decisions made by other people, their actions, their consequences, even their sacrifices, they weren't his responsibility either. Mara had made her choice and had accepted the consequences for it, and he had neither the duty nor the right to try to take it away from her. And I really feel like some of this material is drawing from that kind of theme, where he really has to respect the decisions of other people. And it even connects to what Ahsoka says to Din earlier about, I don't control the choices of others, and at the end of the day, it's like, that person's choice to make. um it's also a big deal, earlier on in the story with Luke and Mara, where she's still struggling with her, loyalty to Palpatine versus potentially walking away from that. And she's kind of afraid that, she's not strong enough to handle that responsibility for, factors that I'm not going to go into, because that's like a whole other long conversation. But um Luke basically does a very similar thing with her in that situation that he does with Grogu. He puts it on her. He says, your destiny's in your hands. It's not in Palpatine's anymore, and it's not in mine. Like, it's in yours. Like, you get to choose where the path leads now, it's both your right and your responsibility to do so. And I just love that it seems like, again, that they're drawing from this, maybe not in terms of specific story details from these stories, but thematically, yes. There's a lot of Zahn in this material that I'm seeing right now. um and the last thing about this point that I'll say is another thing that gets brought up in some of Zahn's older books, and this is from Heir to the Empire, which is the very first book in the Thrawn trilogy, is where Luke is kind of in a similar place in that book where he is in canon right now, where he's trying to figure out, what's the best way to be a Jedi, to lead the next generation of Jedi. And he ends up kind of having this conversation with C3PO where he makes this observation that, well, you know, um and I'm going to actually try to pull up the full quote. And the full quote is, governments and entire planets are important, but when you sift everything down, they're all just made up of people. In other words, a Jedi can't get so caught up in matters of galactic importance that it interferes with his concern for individual people. And again, I see a lot of that being incorporated here with Luke's character and how he behaves towards Grogu, because the matter of galactic importance in this case is Luke needs to rebuild the Jedi Order. Like, this is his responsibility to recruit Jedi and to train them, because, like, as far as he knows right now, he's the only real one. And he could have made that the priority and said, well, I need this kid to stay here because I need, to build up this order and have people training as Jedi. But he sets that aside for a little bit and says, no, I'm going to focus on this student's individual needs and see, what he needs and what he wants for his life, and we'll tackle the issue of building the order later. If he needs to leave, he can leave. And I like that being worked into this.
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything else to add. I think that this is far deeper than I've seen anybody else go into over the last week. So, I mean, you've done your research, and I think that a lot of people will appreciate that. So,
yeah.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, we'll see. I'm really excited to see what Grogu chooses. I'm really excited to see if any of these ideas that we've just talked about are going to be expanded on in the next episode or in any of the future content. I don't know. There's just always something interesting to talk about with this universe. So, any other last thoughts on this whole big long conversation?
Well, I am gonna at the end of this open up the floor to a couple of fan comments that I found that I thought were really interesting and had some really great insight. And I asked permission from some people to share their comments on this episode of the podcast, and in advance, thank you to those of you who replied and said it was okay. So I'm just going to get right to it. The first comment that I have to pull up is from Kenny Holmes, and his comment says, I get the feeling that the choice Grogu is faced with is actually a false dichotomy and a test being made of him. And I think Grogu is mature enough to see as much, meaning that the likely outcome of the choice is that Grogu will move the lightsaber and the Beskar chainmail together, as if to indicate, is there really any difference between the two? That forced choice doomed the old Jedi Order. And I just thought that that was an interesting observation. I've seen other fans talking about the possibility that he could choose both. This was the first comment I saw myself suggesting this, which is why I wanted to bring attention to it. So thank you, Kenny, for allowing me to share. And I think that it's possible that we could get something like this where he does want to choose both, and it makes Luke reconsider things, because like you said, like, does he know about Tarre Vizsla? We don't know. And it's like the life of the Mandalorians versus the Jedi, is it really that incompatible? Like maybe that's the question that's really being posed here. Maybe he can be both, and maybe he should be both. I do think there's a possibility like they're setting up some sort of, I don't know, Grogu is the new Tarre Vizsla type thing happening in this story. So I think that, yeah, I think that this could potentially be a possibility, and that it could be a learning opportunity for Luke himself, which leads me into the next comment from the Stark Knight Returns, um, which says, I think that Grogu's choice in Luke's test is in fact a learning experience for Luke and not Grogu. He still hasn't reached his legend stage where he allows for Jedi to build relationships and attachment. So Grogu's decision is what will make him rethink the Jedi philosophy. Remember, Ahsoka told him that the student overcomes the master. And I like that this comment brought up Ahsoka mentioning this to Luke, that sometimes, it's the student that guides the master, it's the student that guides the teacher. And I think that this is a possibility as well. I think we touched on it a little bit, that Luke could learn from this. Like Grogu could introduce a third option into the equation that Luke hadn't considered and make him go, huh, that's interesting. What do I do with this information? And I really want to believe that that line is not a throwaway line. I feel like it was put in there possibly very intentionally. And yeah, and I think just to connect to my own experience in that field, that if, a good teacher has to be just as open to teaching the students, and or I mean to say, a good teacher should be just as open to learning from their students and from the experience of teaching their students as they are to teaching them. It's a two-way street, and a lot of the times, being in a teaching position, you do end up learning more lessons that the kids may, unintentionally teach you than you feel like you're teaching them. So this could definitely be the case with Luke. So again, thank you to the Stark Knight Returns for your comment. And the last comment that I'm going to read out is just a really great one, and I think I'm just going to let majority of it speak for itself, because it's really well put. And this is from Sean Heimbuck. I'm sorry if I'm butchering your name, but the comment says, I think this is perfectly in keeping with Luke's character. No other Jedi has understood both the redeeming possibility of attachment and the dedication of the Jedi, or has been in the position of learning from the mistakes of the Jedi. Remember, the Jedi were not given a choice. They were taken from their families and trained to be Jedi, and the dogma around that practice is what eventually caused their destruction. Luke did have a choice. He chose to go with Ben to Alderaan and learn the Force. He chose to go to Dagobah. From his own experiences and what he learned about his father, Luke knows intimately the consequences of attachment versus commitment and how they can be balanced to serve the greater good. He knows Grogu receiving training when his attachments are greater than his commitment is dangerous. Anakin is a perfect example of that. But unlike the Jedi, Luke is not forcing the choice to commit. He is allowing Grogu to choose that commitment or not. He knows the only commitment that can last is the one that is chosen. And I just want to close on that, because that was a really well put comment. So thank you, Sean.
Yeah, I really like that. If the crux of this episode really is Grogu's choice, then recognizing that the only choice, or the only vow that's going to remain, is one that has to be made from the heart, and we're going to find out exactly where Grogu's heart lies. So and in a way, just like with attachment, with Luke trying to find a via media, it's kind of the same with Grogu, like that first comment said. I have a feeling that this will be something that is at least partially subverted, in order to say Jedi and Mandalorian, it's not, they aren't as different as you may think. And so in a way, instead of this is the way, it's this is the middle way. Rim shot. So we'll see. I'll be curious to know how much of the final episode is taken up with this matter in particular, and how much might be saved for Mando season 3. We might not get um a lot of details the next episode. We've got a lot to cover in the next episode. And I definitely want that attention to be on Boba and his story, and everything else that we need to clear up on Tatooine. So um I've got thoughts on the finale, but at the same time, I think we've been going pretty long. And ultimately, what's the point of speculating? You know, it's usually just a way to look back and see all the ways you were wrong anyway. So, but do you have any speculations about the final episode, the things that we're going to be seeing?
I don't know. I mean, people have been throwing about all sorts of things. I really do hope we get Boba riding the Rancor, because they teased
Yes.
that. That has to happen. I know some people think that, like, well, Grogu will choose the chainmail, and that'll mean Luke has to bring him to Tatooine, and then he'll get involved in the fight. I don't know if that's going to happen. I think we at least need Boba riding the Rancor.
Yeah.
Like, you gave that to us, and we need to see it. So
Yep. Yep. 100%. That's after 2 hours of talking about Jedi and attachment, we're gonna end with the fact that the only thing that matters is Boba and the Rancor. I
yes,
think
of
that's
course.
a good conclusion. So yes, thank you so much to the commenters that Arica read. And if any of you have any comments on this conversation, I'd love to hear them as well. As always, you can reach out to me at Darksaber Light on Twitter. And we will be back next week after what I assume will be a very exciting finale. So, as always, have a great week, and may the force be with you.